Hola, me llamo Kate Miller and this is my language and cultural contact presentation. For this presentation, I watched Shrek. I listened to a podcast on Dixo.com. I listened to a lot of regional Mexican radio stations in Phoenix, Arizona, including 103.5, and I read a few articles on La Paz, Arizona newspaper. So Shrek is a traditionally English children's movie that I listened to translated in Spanish with Spanish subtitles as well. Words that I learned from this movie included burro, which is a donkey, princesa is a princess, rey is a king, no eres, you are not, and puesta de sol, which is a sunset. And there were not a lot of cultural practices or nuances displayed in this movie because, like I said before, it was originally an English movie that was translated, and I was able from this to understand a lot of the content because it is a movie that I was familiar with, and to view a lot of interactions and how true conversation works in Spanish. Dixo.com is a podcast website where talk shows and speakers come on to talk about social issues. Some of the examples are media, politics, relationships, and nutrition. And I came into the end of a podcast on nutrition and then listened to a full podcast on relationships. So some of the vocabulary that I learned from this are relación is a relationship, a relación sexual is a sexual relationship. I learned the límites are boundaries, importante, important, knowing what's important to you in your relación. Trabajo is a job, hijos are children, and nutrición was nutrition. And I saw a lot of comparisons to the American culture in really setting boundaries in a sexual relationship and when to introduce a new partner to your family and your children, really identifying when they have a job. So I thought it was very interesting to hear a full podcast on this type of relationship. And there were a lot more similarities in this podcast than I guess what I may have expected to be hearing on a Spanish-spoken podcast. I also listened to a fair amount of regional Mexican radio stations in Phoenix, and I learned a lot of new vocabulary from the advertisements. So venta is sale, bicicleta is bicycle, eventos are events, and also words that I learned from songs were te amo, is I love you, and besos are kisses. And I was able to pull a lot of this content by being able to recognize a few of the words and pulling up a few more to define, but I felt like I was able to get a pretty good understanding. However, there were not a lot of cultural differences displayed in things like advertisements because they were local Phoenix radio stations, and many events and advertisements were for things that would also be advertised on the English-spoken radios as well. I took a few articles out of the La Paz, Arizona newspaper, which is a sister publication of the Arizona Republic, and this newspaper shares local and national news for the Spanish-speaking community in Phoenix. So, some of the vocabulary that I was able to learn from this are noticias is news, deportes is sports. One that was particularly relevant to me as an orthopedic nurse is una fractura de peroné, is a fracture of the fibula. I read that in an article in the deportes section, the sports section. And another article that I read was discussing a local biblioteca, local library, and how they were having events to promote lectura, which is reading among hijos, or children, and niños. And again, this did show more culture of the Hispanic culture. Many of these things were events and articles were specific to the Spanish-speaking community in Phoenix, whereas many of them were also similar to what would be in the Arizona Republic, the English newspaper. It did also show a lot of articles about things happening in Mexico. So overall, from this experience, I found that I was able to piece together a lot of larger meaning of each exposure based on the few words that I know, and I found much less contrast between the American and the more Hispanic cultures than I may have expected. A lot of the content was very similar. I found, variations in music styles on the different Mexican radio stations. I found advertisements, like I said, for things that would be on the American and also the Latino radio stations. So, overall, very good exposure for me, and I am looking forward to seeing more contrast, perhaps, in my future exposures.